At 09:45 on the morning of November 14, 1943, the sky over the Solomon Islands was a perfect, blinding blue. Lieutenant James "Jim" Miller sat in the cockpit of his B-24 Liberator, a heavy bomber nicknamed the Glass House, watching his fuel gauges drop. He was 20,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, and he was completely alone. The rest of his squadron had turned back 30 minutes ago due to engine trouble, but Miller had pushed on. Now, he was regretting that decision. Far below him, against the dark blue of the water, he saw the glint of sunlight on metal. It wasn't one plane. It was a swarm. 15 Japanese A6M0s were climbing in a tight spiral, looking like a school of sharks smelling blood in the water. Miller gripped the yoke and checked his crew status. The B-24 was a beast of a plane. It was faster and had a longer range than the famous B-17 Flying Fortress, but it had a reputation for being difficult to fly. The pilots called it the flying boxcar because it handled like a brick with wings. It was heavy, exhausted the pilots, and had one fatal flaw that every Japanese pilot in the Pacific knew about. The early model B-24s did not have a ball turret, that spinning glass bubble on the belly of the plane that carried 2 machine guns. Instead, the belly of Miller's plane was just a flat sheet of aluminum. It was a blind spot the size of a barn door. The Japanese pilots were smart. They didn't attack from the front, where the nose gunner could see them. They didn't attack from the top, where the turret gunner could shred them. They attacked from directly below. They would fly into the bomber's shadow, match its speed, and then pull up into a vertical climb. They would hang there, suspended on their propellers, and rake the belly of the bomber with 20mm cannon fire. The American gunners inside could hear the shells hitting the floor, but they couldn't shoot back. They were helpless. It was like fighting a boxer who was allowed to punch you in the kidneys while your hands were tied to your chest. Miller watched the Zeros form up. They were taking their time. They knew the Glass House was a straggler. They knew it had no fighter escort. And most importantly, they knew it had a blind belly. They split into 3 groups of 5. The first group accelerated, diving low to get into the kill position beneath the bomber. Miller felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He knew the standard procedure. The manual said to weave the plane, to bank left and right to give the waist gunners a shot. But banking a heavy bomber at 20,000 feet killed your airspeed and made you a sitting duck. The manual was a suicide note. This exact scenario was why Miller had nearly been court-martialed 3 days earlier on the tarmac at Guadalcanal. The argument had happened in the blistering heat, right under the wing of the bomber. Miller and his crew chief, a red-headed sergeant named O'Malley from Chicago, had been standing there with a toolbox and a crazy idea. They were staring at the camera hatch in the tail section of the plane. It was a small square door in the floor, designed for taking reconnaissance photos. During combat missions, it was supposed to be bolted shut and sealed to maintain cabin pressure and aerodynamics. Miller wanted to take the door off. Completely off. He wanted to fly a combat mission with a gaping hole in the bottom of his plane. And he didn't just want a hole. He wanted to mount a twin .50 caliber machine gun package on a bungee cord suspension system right over the opening. It was a field modification, which is the Army's polite way of saying they were rigging it up with spare parts and hope. The idea was simple. If the Zeros attacked from below, O'Malley would strap himself into a safety harness, lean over the hole, and fire straight down. It was the only way to cover the blind spot. The regimental colonel had walked up while they were wrenching the bolts off the hatch. He was a by-the-book officer, a man who believed that regulations were written by geniuses and followed by soldiers. He looked at the missing hatch, then at the bungee cords, then at Miller. He turned a shade of purple that matched the exhaust flames. He told Miller that he had lost his mind. He explained the physics of the situation as if Miller were a child. He said that opening a hatch at 200 miles per hour would create massive drag. It would act like a parachute, slowing the bomber down and burning fuel they couldn't afford to waste. The colonel also pointed out the human cost. The open hatch would suck the oxygen out of the plane. At 20,000 feet, the air is thin and freezing. The crew would be fighting hypothermia and hypoxia, and then there was the gunner. O'Malley would be hanging over open space, battered by a 100-mile-an-hour wind stream, trying to aim a heavy machine gun. The colonel called it a suicide trap. He said that if the plane didn't crash from the drag, the gunner would fall out, or the structural integrity of the fuselage would fail. He forbade it. He ordered the hatch sealed and told Miller that if he modified the aircraft again, he would be grounded permanently. Miller had nodded, said, "Yes, sir," and waited for the colonel to drive away in his jeep. As soon as the dust settled, he turned to O'Malley. They didn't put the door back on. They didn't remove the bungee cords. Instead, they covered the hole with a piece of canvas tarp that looked like the metal skin of the plane. It was a flimsy disguise, but it would pass a casual inspection. They were betting their careers and their lives that the colonel wouldn't check the belly of the plane before takeoff. They were gambling that the danger of the Japanese Zeros was greater than the danger of an angry commanding officer. Now, 3 days later, that gamble was being called. The canvas tarp was still covering the hole in the floor near the tail. The bungee-mounted gun was stowed against the wall, hidden under a pile of flak jackets. O'Malley was at his station, wearing his oxygen mask, waiting for the order. The Zeros were moving into position. Miller could see them disappearing under the wings of the B-24. They were sliding into the blind spot. The trap was set. But the trap wasn't set by the Americans. It was set by the Japanese. The first Zero pilot adjusted his throttle. He was confident. He had done this a dozen times before. He looked up and saw the fat, gray belly of the American bomber. It was just a smooth expanse of metal. There were no turrets, no gun barrels pointing down. It was defenseless. He pulled back on his stick, bringing the nose of his fighter up. He lined up his sights on the fuel tanks between the engines. He thumbed the safety off his 20mm cannons. He was going to cut the bomber in half. Inside the B-24, the intercom crackled. It was the tail gunner. His voice was high and tight with fear. He reported that he could see the Zeros dipping below the horizontal stabilizer. They were gone from his sight picture. He couldn't shoot them. The waist gunners reported the same thing. They were leaning out their windows, trying to angle their guns down, but the fuselage was in the way. They were blocked. The enemy was right there, maybe 500 feet away, but they were invisible to the guns. Miller watched his airspeed indicator, 210 miles per hour. If they opened the hatch now, the rush of air would be violent. It could rip the tail off the plane. It could suck O'Malley right out the hole if his harness failed. It was a crazy idea on the ground. Up here, in the thin air of the death zone, it felt like madness. But then Miller heard the first sound of impact. It was the sound of Japanese bullets hitting the aluminum skin of the plane. They were finding the range. The next burst would hit the fuel tanks. The next burst would turn the glass house into a fireball. Miller didn't hesitate anymore. He pressed the transmit button on his throat microphone. He didn't ask for a volunteer. He didn't ask if the equipment was ready. He just gave the order that would either save them or kill them all. "O'Malley," he said, his voice flat and hard over the roar of the engines. "Pop the hatch." When Sergeant O'Malley kicked the canvas tarp away from the camera hatch, the war changed instantly. It didn't feel like opening a door. It felt like a bomb going off inside the fuselage. The air pressure differential at 20,000 feet is violent. The air inside the cabin was relatively still, but the air outside was rushing past at 200 miles per hour. When the barrier vanished, the slipstream roared into the belly of the plane with the force of a hurricane. It ripped the remaining shreds of canvas from the bolts and sent loose debris flying into the tail section like shrapnel. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in a single second. The comfortable, humid warmth of the tropical air was replaced by a freezing blast that cut right through the flight suits. Up in the cockpit, Lieutenant Miller felt the change immediately. It felt as if a giant hand had reached up from the ocean and grabbed the tail of the bomber. The plane lurched violently to the left, then shuddered as the aerodynamics were ruined. The smooth airflow over the belly was gone, replaced by a turbulent vortex that dragged at the fuselage. Miller had to fight the yoke with both hands, his muscles straining to keep the wings level. The airspeed indicator dropped. 210, 200, 190. The drag was acting like a parachute, sucking the momentum out of the heavy bomber. The fuel gauges, already low, seemed to dip just from the extra strain on the engines. Back in the belly, O'Malley was fighting to stay on his feet. The wind was screaming so loud it drowned out the roar of the 4 massive Pratt & Whitney engines. He grabbed the safety line attached to the ceiling ribs, a thick nylon strap he had stolen from a cargo parachute. He clipped it onto the back of his harness. This was the only thing keeping him from falling 5 miles into the Pacific Ocean. He tested the tension, leaning back against the strap. It held. He looked down at the hole. It was a square of terrifying blue, framing the white caps of the waves far below. It was a window into the abyss. Next to the hole hung the weapon. It was a standard M2 Browning 50 caliber machine gun, stripped of its heavy tripod. Instead of a solid metal mount, O'Malley had rigged it up with a cluster of heavy-duty industrial bungee cords wrapped around the ceiling beams. The gun hung suspended in the air, bouncing slightly with the vibration of the plane. It looked ridiculous. It looked like a child's toy swing, but the bungees served a critical purpose. They absorbed the violent recoil of the gun, and more importantly, they allowed O'Malley to swing the weapon freely in any direction. It was a floating gun, untethered by gears or motors. O'Malley grabbed the spade grips of the heavy machine gun. He wrestled it into position, pointing the barrel straight down through the open hatch. The wind stream caught the barrel and tried to rip it out of his hands, pushing it backward. He had to lean his entire body weight onto the weapon to keep it steady. He stepped up to the edge of the hole, placing his boots on the narrow metal rim of the hatch frame. One slip and his leg would go through, likely snapping the bone against the metal edge or leaving him dangling by his harness in the freezing slipstream. He planted his feet, grit his teeth against the cold, and looked down. The view was perfect. Below him, the first wave of Japanese Zeros was climbing. They were beautiful, deadly machines, painted in dark green with the bright red circle of the rising sun on their wings. They were in a tight formation, noses pointed up, propellers clawing for altitude. To the Japanese pilots, the bomber looked asleep. They saw no turrets spinning. They saw no gun barrels tracking them. They were flying into the blind spot with the confidence of executioners. They were less than 800 yards away now, closing fast. They were so close O'Malley could see the oil streaks on their engine cowlings. The Japanese pilots were staring at the belly of the B-24, waiting for the right moment to open fire. They expected to see nothing but aluminum skin. Instead, the lead pilot saw a square hole open up. He might have been confused for a tenth of a second. He might have thought the bomber was dumping debris or that it had taken damage. He certainly did not expect to see a man in a leather flight jacket hanging halfway out of the plane, wrestling a machine gun that was spitting fire directly into his face. O'Malley didn't fire a warning shot. He clamped down on the trigger butterfly and held it. The heavy machine gun roared to life, shaking in his hands like a jackhammer. The bungee cords stretched and snapped, absorbing the kick. The brass shell casings ejected from the side of the gun and were instantly sucked out of the hole by the wind, raining down into the ocean. A stream of tracers, bright lines of burning magnesium, erupted from the belly of the bomber. But unlike normal turret fire that arcs out, this fire went straight down. It was a vertical column of death. The physics of the engagement were brutally unfair to the Japanese. Usually when a fighter attacks a bomber, the bullets hit the wings or the fuselage at an angle, often glancing off the rounded surfaces. But O'Malley was firing down into the top of the Zeros. He was shooting through the thinnest part of their armor. The 50 caliber rounds, each the size of a marker pen, smashed into the engine blocks and cockpits of the climbing fighters. Gravity was helping the bullets, adding speed and energy to the impact. The lead Zero flew right into the stream. The pilot never had a chance to evade. The heavy rounds punched through the glass canopy and the thin aluminum engine cover. The fighter shuddered as the engine block cracked. A plume of black smoke erupted from the nose, blinding the pilot. The plane stalled instantly, its upward momentum crushed by the damage. It rolled over onto its back, shedding pieces of cowling, and began a death spiral toward the water. The second Zero, the wingman, was right behind the leader. He was so focused on maintaining his formation that he didn't realize what had happened until he flew through the debris of the first plane. He looked up and saw the muzzle flash sparkling from the open hatch. He tried to bank away, to roll out of the line of fire, but a Zero in a vertical climb is slow. It's hanging on its propeller. It doesn't have the speed to maneuver quickly. It was like trying to steer a car on ice. O'Malley swung the floating gun on its bungee cords, tracking the movement with ease. He walked the tracers across the second plane's right wing. The Japanese Zeros were famous for being agile, but they were also famous for being fragile. They lacked self-sealing fuel tanks. A single incendiary round in the wing root could turn the whole plane into a torch. O'Malley's burst found the fuel tank. There was a bright flash of orange fire, silent over the roar of the wind. The wings simply separated from the fuselage. The Zero disintegrated in midair, turning into a cloud of burning aluminum and gasoline. Two down, up in the cockpit, Miller could feel the vibrations of the gun firing through the floorboards. He felt the dull recoil fighting against the frame. He didn't need the intercom to know what was happening. He checked the rearview mirror, but he couldn't see the action. He just saw the smoke trailing behind them. "Keep it steady, Jim, keep it steady," he whispered to himself. He fought the drag, making tiny corrections to the rudder to keep the platform stable for O'Malley. The bomber was groaning under the stress. The open hatch was creating turbulence that rattled the tail section, shaking the rivets in their holes. Back at the hatch, the element of surprise was complete. The third, fourth, and fifth Zeros in the first wave broke formation in panic. They had flown into a trap. They dove away, scattering like birds frightened by a gunshot. They couldn't understand where the fire was coming from. It defied their training. It defied the schematics of the B-24 they had studied. They pulled back to a safe distance, buzzing angrily around the bomber, trying to make sense of the new reality. O'Malley let off the trigger. The gun barrel was smoking hot, the heat waves shimmering in the freezing air. He was panting, his breath fogging up his goggles. His arms ached from wrestling the heavy weapon against the slipstream. He looked down at the ocean. Two black smears of oil and burning wreckage marked the graves of the first two attackers. He pulled the charging handle back on the machine gun, ejecting a dud round and seating a fresh one. He checked the ammunition belt. It was feeding smoothly from the box bolted to the wall. The MacGyver rig was holding, but the fight wasn't over. The Japanese pilots were elite veterans. They didn't panic for long. They regrouped 1,000 yards below and behind the bomber. They were talking to each other on their radios, pointing out the open hatch. They realized what the Americans had done. They saw the single gun hanging there. They did the math. One gun. One narrow field of fire, and there were still 13 Zeros left. The squadron leader rocked his wings, signaling the others. They weren't going to attack in a single file line anymore. That was a mistake. They were going to swarm. They split into two groups. One group moved to the left, the other to the right. They began to climb again, but this time they spread out. They planned to attack from both sides simultaneously, converging on the belly of the bomber in a V-shape. They knew O'Malley couldn't shoot at two targets at once. If he turned to shoot the left group, the right group would gut the bomber. If he shot the right, the left would kill him. Miller saw the maneuver from the cockpit. He watched the fighters split and widen their formation. "They're pincering us," he yelled over the intercom. "O'Malley, you've got bandits at 4 o'clock low and 8 o'clock low. They're coming all at once." O'Malley looked down. He saw the trap closing. The Zeros were climbing fast now, engines screaming. They were angry. They were coming for blood. The turkey shoot was over. Now it was a brawl. O'Malley tightened his grip on the spade handles. He checked his safety harness one last time. He knew he couldn't stop them all. He just hoped he could kill enough of them to make the rest flinch. He swung the gun to the left, waiting for the first nose to cross his sights. The wind howled through the open hatch, sounding like a chorus of screaming ghosts. The sky beneath the bomber turned into a kaleidoscope of violence. The 13 remaining Japanese fighters didn't come up in a polite line this time. They coordinated their assault with the precision of a wolf pack taking down a bison. 7 Zeros banked hard to the left, dropping low to gain speed before pulling up. 6 Zeros mirrored the move on the right. They were timing their climb so they would arrive at the belly of the B-24 at the exact same second. It was a classic pincer movement, designed to split the gunner's attention and force him to expose his back to half the enemy force. O'Malley stood on the edge of the open hatch, his boots slipping on the freezing metal rim. The wind was tearing at his flight suit, flapping the leather jacket against his ribs like a drum. He saw the two groups climbing. He knew he couldn't shoot them all. The math was simple and terrifying. The M2 Browning fired 800 rounds per minute. The Zeros were closing at 300 miles per hour. He had maybe 4 seconds to engage the left group before the right group was in range to blow him out of the sky. He had to make a choice. He chose the left. He swung the heavy gun on its bungee suspension. The rubber cords groaned under the tension, stretching out like giant rubber bands. He leaned his entire body weight into the turn, fighting the slipstream that tried to push the barrel back. He didn't aim for a specific plane. He aimed for the space in front of them, creating a curtain of steel. He clamped the trigger down. The gun bucked and roared. A wall of tracers erupted from the hatch, slashing across the sky in a bright, deadly arc. The lead Zero on the left flew straight into the saw blade. The .50 caliber rounds didn't just poke holes. They tore chunks of metal off the airframe. The pilot tried to roll away, but the bullets walked up his fuselage like a chainsaw. One round hit the ammunition drum for his 20mm cannon. The wing exploded from the inside out. The Zero didn't fall. It simply disintegrated into a cloud of confetti and fire. The pilot behind him flew through the fireball, his windshield instantly coated in oil and soot. Blinded, he pulled up hard, narrowly missing the bomber's tail, and fell out of the fight. But while O'Malley was shredding the left flank, the right flank was closing in. The 6 Zeros on the right side had a clear shot. They climbed vertically, their engines screaming. The pilots looked up and saw the gunner's back turned to them. They saw the open hatch. They saw the vulnerable fuel lines and the bomb bay doors. They thumbed their firing buttons. Cannon shells began to hammer the belly of the B-24. It sounded like someone was throwing handfuls of gravel against a tin roof, only the gravel was exploding metal. Shrapnel pinged through the floorboards. A jagged piece of steel sliced through O'Malley's pant leg, missing his calf by an inch. The plane lurched as a shell punched a hole in the right stabilizer. Up in the cockpit, Miller wrestled with the controls. The bomber wanted to roll over and die. The drag from the open hatch combined with the damage to the tail made the plane handle like a dump truck with flat tires. Miller yelled over the intercom, "Brake right, braking right." He hauled the yoke over, throwing the heavy bomber into a violent bank. This wasn't standard procedure. You weren't supposed to bank a bomber during a gunfight because it threw off the gunner's aim. But Miller wasn't trying to help O'Malley aim. He was trying to save O'Malley's life. By banking the plane, he shifted the angle of the fuselage. The Zeros attacking from the right suddenly lost their clean shot at the belly. Instead of a flat target, they were looking at a steep, sliding wall of aluminum. The maneuver threw O'Malley off his feet. The floor tilted 45 degrees. He slipped on the slick metal and fell toward the open hole. For a heart-stopping second, he was sliding out into the abyss. his boots kicked at empty air. He clawed at the floor, his gloves scraping against the rivets. The safety harness snapped tight, catching him with a brutal jerk that knocked the wind out of his lungs. He was dangling halfway out of the plane, 5 miles above the ocean, staring straight down at the sharks. Most men would have frozen. Most men would have scrambled back inside and curled up in a ball. O'Malley wasn't most men. He realized that falling out of the plane had actually given him a better angle. He was now hanging below the fuselage, completely clear of the structure. He had a 360-degree view of the battle. He grabbed the spade grips of the machine gun, which was bouncing wildly on its bungees next to him. He pulled the weapon down to his level. He was fighting upside down, suspended by a nylon strap, spinning in the wind. He saw the Zeros on the right flank trying to adjust to Miller's turn. They were slow, hanging on their props. O'Malley squeezed the trigger. He fired from the hip, spraying bullets like he was watering a lawn with a fire hose. The angle was impossible. The Japanese pilots had never seen a gunner firing from outside the plane. They flew right into the spray. One of the Zeros took a round through the propeller hub. The prop shattered, sending shrapnel slicing into the cockpit. The plane stalled and dropped like a stone. Another Zero took a hit to the oil cooler. A stream of white smoke erupted from the engine, trailing behind it like a ghostly ribbon. The pilot broke off, diving for the safety of the clouds. The formation on the right shattered. They couldn't handle the chaos. They couldn't handle the madman hanging from a strap, turning their perfect ambush into a barroom brawl. Miller leveled the plane out. O'Malley scrambled back inside, his muscles burning with lactic acid. He dragged the heavy gun back up with him. He checked the ammo belt. It was running dry. The red tracer rounds, usually placed every 5th bullet, were coming up fast. That meant he had maybe 50 shots left, a 3-second burst. And there were still 8 Zeros circling below, regrouping for another pass. The Japanese pilots were wary now. They had lost 4 planes in 2 minutes. They knew the belly wasn't blind anymore. But they also knew the B-24 was damaged. They could see the smoke trailing from the right engine. They could see the holes in the tail. They decided to change tactics. Instead of a coordinated group attack, they would try a kamikaze-style charge. One by one, they would sprint straight up, fire a quick burst, and peel away. They would peck the bomber to death. The first one came up fast, weaving back and forth to throw off O'Malley's aim. O'Malley didn't take the bait. He waited. He knew he didn't have the ammo to spray and pray. He had to be a sniper with a machine gun. He watched the Zero get bigger in the hatch frame. 800 yards, 600, 400. He could see the pilot's face behind the goggles. He could see the muzzle flashes of the Zero's machine guns sparkling. Bullets zipped past the open hatch, punching holes in the ceiling of the bomber. O'Malley stood like a statue, ignoring the lead buzzing around his head like angry hornets. At 200 yards, he fired. A short, controlled burst. 6 rounds, that was it. But at point-blank range, 6 rounds of 50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary ammunition is enough to kill anything that flies. The bullets smashed into the Zero's nose. The engine block shattered. The fighter's momentum carried it upward, dead in the air. It drifted closer, looming ominously in the hatch, a smoking wreck threatening to collide with the bomber. O'Malley could have reached out and touched the wingtip as it stalled and fell away backward, tumbling end over end toward the sea. The gun clicked dry, the belt was empty. O'Malley cursed. "Ammo," he screamed into the intercom. "I'm dry, reloading." He dropped the empty ammo box and kicked it aside. He grabbed a fresh box from the stack bolted to the wall. It weighed 35 pounds. The plane was bouncing through turbulence, making it hard to stand. He fumbled with the latch, his fingers numb from the cold. He ripped the lid off and pulled out the start of the belt. Below him, the next Zero was already climbing. The pilot saw the gun stop firing. He saw his chance. He pushed his throttle to the firewall. He was coming for the kill. O'Malley flipped the feed cover of the machine gun open. He jammed the fresh belt onto the feed tray. The fighter was 300 yards out. O'Malley slammed the cover down. It didn't latch. Debris or ice was blocking the mechanism. The Zero was 200 yards out, cannons firing. Explosions walked across the belly of the bomber, shaking O'Malley's teeth. He smashed his fist onto the feed cover. Once, twice. The mechanism locked. He grabbed the charging handle and ripped it back, chambering around. The Zero was 100 yards away, filling the entire view of the hatch. It was so close it blocked out the ocean. O'Malley didn't aim. He just buried the trigger. The gun roared. The stream of tracers went straight down the throat of the attacking fighter. The Zero pilot flinched. He pulled up hard to avoid the fire, but he was too close. The burst caught him in the cockpit. The canopy shattered. The plane jerked violently to the right, missing the open hatch by feet. The wash from its propeller slammed into O'Malley, knocking him backward against the fuselage wall. The sound of the screaming engine was deafening, a physical roar that vibrated in his chest. Then it was gone, falling away into the blue. That was the breaking point. The remaining 6 Zeros had seen enough. They had watched their squadron get chewed up by a single gun in a suicide door. They had watched their wingmen explode, burn, and spiral into the sea. They were low on fuel. They were low on ammo. And they were terrified of the crazy American hanging out of the bottom of the plane. The leader rocked his wings, signaling a retreat. They banked away, diving for the deck, running for home. O'Malley didn't cheer. He didn't wave his fist. He just slumped against the wall of the fuselage, sliding down until he hit the floor. The wind was still howling through the open hatch, freezing the sweat on his face. The machine gun hung on its bungee cords, smoking and swaying gently like a pendulum. The floor around the hatch was covered in a carpet of hot brass casings and steel belt links. Up in the cockpit, Miller watched the Zeros disappear into the clouds. He let out a breath he felt like he had been holding for an hour. He checked the gauges. The number 3 engine was overheating. The hydraulic pressure was dropping. The tail control was mushy, but the sky was empty. Clear, he whispered into his mask. Then he keyed the mic. "O'Malley, you still with us back there?" There was a long pause. Static crackled on the line. Then a tired, shaky voice came back. "Yes, Skipper, I'm here, but I think we're gonna need a new door. I kinda shot the hinges off the old one." Miller cracked a smile. It was the first time he had smiled in 6 hours. He adjusted the trim tabs, fighting the drag of the open hatch one last time. They were alive. They had flown a brick through a meat grinder and come out the other side. "Don't worry about the door, Red," Miller said. "I think the Colonel is going to have bigger things to worry about when we get back." The flight back to Guadalcanal was the longest 2 hours of Jim Miller's life. The B-24 Glasshouse was a flying wreck. The number 3 engine finally gave up the ghost 10 miles out from the island, coughing a black cloud of smoke before seizing up completely. Miller had to feather the prop, turning the blades sideways to slice through the wind. The hydraulic system was shot, which meant the landing gear had to be hand-cranked down by the crew. It was a grueling, sweat-soaked effort. O'Malley and the waist gunners took turns spinning the emergency wheel in the catwalk, their arms screaming in protest, counting the rotations until the wheels locked into place. They crossed the runway threshold at 140 miles per hour, coming in hot. Miller fought the controls all the way down. The damage to the tail made the plane want to yaw to the left, drifting toward the jungle at the edge of the tarmac. He slammed his boot on the right rudder pedal, forcing the nose straight. The tires screeched against the crushed coral of the runway. The bomber bounced once, twice, then settled. Miller stood on the brakes. The plane shuddered and groaned, bleeding off speed, until it finally came to a halt at the far end of the airfield. The prop spun down to a stop. Silence rushed back in, louder than the engines had ever been. They were alive. But as Miller looked out the cockpit window, his relief turned back into dread. A jeep was already racing across the tarmac toward them. It wasn't the medical truck. It wasn't the fuel truck. It was the command jeep. The colonel was in the passenger seat. He looked like a storm cloud wrapped in khaki. He had seen the plane land. He had seen the missing hatch. He knew exactly what they had done. Miller and his crew climbed out of the waist door. They dropped onto the hot coral, their legs wobbly. They looked like coal miners. Their faces were black with soot and oil. Their flight suits were stiff with sweat and salt spray. O'Malley was limping, favoring the leg that had been grazed by shrapnel. They stood in a ragged line under the wing of their broken bird. The colonel's jeep skidded to a halt in front of them. The officer jumped out before the wheels stopped rolling. He marched up to Miller, his face twisted in fury. He didn't ask if they were okay. He didn't ask about the mission. He pointed a shaking finger at the gaping hole in the belly of the plane. The colonel started shouting. He shouted about court-martials before he even took a breath. He listed the charges like he was reading from a ledger: disobeying a direct order, destruction of government property, endangering the aircraft, reckless conduct. He screamed that Miller was finished. He screamed that he would strip the wings off Miller's chest and have him scrubbing latrines in Leavenworth for the rest of the war. He called the open hatch a disgrace to the uniform and a violation of every safety regulation in the Army Air Force's handbook. Miller stood at attention and took it. He didn't argue. He knew the colonel was right on paper. They had disobeyed orders. They had broken the rules. But then a second jeep pulled up. This one was driving slower. It was the intelligence officer, a quiet major with a clipboard and a pair of binoculars. He got out and walked over to the group. He didn't look at the colonel. He walked straight past him and stopped in front of O'Malley. He looked at the pile of empty brass casings that had spilled out of the hatch onto the runway. He looked at the shredded aluminum of the hatch frame. Then he looked at O'Malley. The major asked one simple question. He asked how many fighters they had seen. Miller answered for his crew. He told the major they had been jumped by 15 Zeros. The colonel scoffed. He said that was impossible. No lone B-24 survived an attack by 15 fighters. He accused Miller of exaggerating to cover up his incompetence. But the major held up a hand. He had received a radio report from a P-38 reconnaissance pilot who had been flying in the same sector. The pilot had seen the smoke. He had seen the wreckage in the water. The major read from his clipboard. The recon pilot had confirmed 7 burning wrecks in the water south of Bougainville. 7, that was half a squadron. The major looked at the colonel. He explained that a standard bomber formation of 12 planes usually claimed 2 or 3 kills on a good day. One single plane, flying alone with a broken door, had just destroyed 7 enemy fighters and routed the rest. The major suggested that whatever reckless conduct the colonel was screaming about seemed to be the most effective anti-fighter tactic they had seen in the entire Pacific theater. The colonel stopped shouting. He looked at the clipboard. He looked at the hole in the plane. Then he looked at O'Malley, who was leaning against the landing gear, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. The colonel was a rigid man, but he wasn't stupid. He knew you couldn't court-martial a hero. You couldn't send a man to prison for shooting down 7 Zeros. The anger drained out of his face, replaced by a confused, grudging respect. He cleared his throat. He told Miller to get his plane fixed. Then he turned around, got back in his Jeep, and drove away without saying another word. The court-martial was over before it began. Word of the tunnel gun spread through the base like wildfire. By the next morning, every B-24 crew on Guadalcanal was down at the boneyard, scavenging for parts. They were ripping the doors off their camera hatches. They were stealing bungee cords from the supply depots. They were welding makeshift mounts for 50 caliber machine guns. The Miller mod became the unofficial standard for the squadron. The crews didn't wait for permission anymore. They realized that the manual was written by men sitting at desks in Washington, while the war was being fought by men hanging out of holes in the sky. The tactic worked. For the next 6 months, Japanese pilots who tried to attack B-24s from below got a nasty surprise. They would climb up for the kill, expecting a blind belly, only to be met by a storm of lead raining down from the suicide door. The kill rates for the squadron skyrocketed. The loss rates dropped. The Japanese were forced to change their tactics again, abandoning the belly attack for head-on passes, which were much more dangerous for them. The blind spot had been closed, not by a factory upgrade, but by a couple of guys with a wrench and a bad attitude. Eventually, the factories caught up. The new B-24J models started arriving in the Pacific. These planes came equipped with the Sperry ball turret, a retractable glass bubble with twin machine guns, and a computer-assisted sight. It was a marvel of engineering. It was pressurized, heated, and safe. The tunnel gun became obsolete. The camera hatches were sealed up again. The bungee cords were taken down. The era of the open-air gunfighter was over. Jim Miller finished his tour of duty and went home. He never flew a plane again. He moved back to Ohio, opened a hardware store, and raised a family. He was a quiet man who didn't like to talk about the war. If you asked him about his medals, he would shrug and change the subject. He didn't see himself as a hero. He saw himself as a guy who just wanted to keep his friends alive. Red O'Malley stayed in the Air Force for 20 years. He became a master mechanic, teaching young crews how to keep their jets flying. He was famous for his creative solutions to mechanical problems. He would tell his students that the book is a guide, not a Bible. He would tell them that when the engine quits and the ground is coming up fast, you don't look for the page number, you look for the wrench. The B-24 Glasshouse didn't survive the war. It was scrapped in 1945, cut up into aluminum ingots to make soda cans and car parts. But the story survived. It was passed down in flight mess halls and mechanics' bays. It became a legend among the bomber crews. It was a reminder that in the cold calculus of combat, the human element is the only variable that matters. You can build a perfect machine, but a machine can't improvise. A machine can't get angry. A machine can't decide to tear a hole in its own skin just to get a clear shot at the enemy. The legacy of the tunnel gun isn't about the kill count. It isn't about the 7 zeros that went into the drink that day. It's about the mindset. It's about the refusal to accept a fatal flaw. Miller and O'Malley looked at a problem that everyone said was unsolvable, and they solved it by breaking every rule in the book. They proved that sometimes the safest place to be is hanging by a strap over the edge of the world, fighting back. We rescue these stories to ensure Jim Miller and Red O'Malley don't disappear into silence. They represent a generation that didn't wait for permission to survive. They built the solution with their own hands, tested it with their own lives, and walked away when the job was done. So the next time you see a rule that doesn't make sense or a problem that seems impossible, remember the glass house, remember the open hatch, and remember that sometimes you have to open the door to let the hurricane in.